The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant William Hayes adjusted his red uniform for the third time that hour. At 28 years old, he had served as a member of the Queen's Guard for nearly 6 years, but today felt different. There was an electricity in the air that made his skin prickle with unease. William had always taken pride in his ability to remain perfectly still during his duties. Standing guard was more than just a job to him. It was a sacred responsibility passed down through generations of his family. His grandfather had stood guard for King George VI, and his father had served Queen Elizabeth II with distinction. The Hayes family name was synonymous with unwavering loyalty and discipline. As he took his position outside the main entrance to the royal residence, William noticed the usual crowd of tourists beginning to gather. Camera phones were already being raised, and he could hear the excited chatter of visitors from around the world. This was nothing new. Every day brought hundreds of people hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty or to test the famous stoicism of the guards. Among the crowd, a group of young men in their early 20s stood out. They were dressed casually in ripped jeans and graphic t-shirts, their behavior already more boisterous than the typical tourist. William's trained eye immediately catalogued them as potential troublemakers, but he remained motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. The leader of the group, a tall young man with bleached hair and multiple facial piercings, seemed to be putting on a show for his friends. He pointed directly at William and said something that made the others laugh loudly. William could feel their attention focused on him like a spotlight, but he maintained his composure. He had dealt with this type of provocation before. Meanwhile, just inside the castle walls, Prince George was finishing his morning tutoring session with his private instructor, Dr. Margaret Thornton. At 11 years old, the young prince was already showing signs of the intelligence and quick wit that ran in his family. Today's lesson had focused on British history, specifically the role of the monarchy in modern society. "Your Royal Highness, Dr." Thornton said as she closed her leather-bound notebook, "Remember what we discussed about duty and service. These concepts will become increasingly important as you grow older." Prince George nodded thoughtfully. "Dr. Thornton, why do people sometimes dislike the royal family? I heard some people talking outside yesterday, and they didn't sound very happy." The tutor paused, choosing her words carefully. "That's a very perceptive question, George. Democracy means that people have the right to express different opinions, even about the monarchy. Some people question whether royal traditions are still relevant in today's world. But many others, like the guards who protect you and your family, believe deeply in the importance of service and tradition." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of raised voices drifted through the castle windows. Prince George moved toward the window, his curiosity piqued. From his vantage point on the second floor, he could see the crowd gathered in the courtyard below and the distinctive red uniform of the guard standing at attention. Back in the courtyard, the situation was beginning to escalate. The group of young men had moved closer to William, and their leader was now speaking directly to him, his voice loud enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear clearly. "Look at this guy," the provocateur called out, gesturing dramatically at William. "Standing there like a robot. I bet he doesn't even think for himself. Just another puppet of the monarchy, wasting taxpayer money on fancy dress-up games." William felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard similar taunts countless times before. The training he had received at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. The key was to remain professional and avoid giving the troublemakers the reaction they were seeking. One of the other men in the group, emboldened by his friend's boldness, stepped even closer. "I wonder what would happen if we just..." He reached out as if to touch William's rifle, stopping just short of making contact. This action caused a ripple of concern to pass through the crowd of tourists. Many began taking photos and videos, sensing that they might be witnessing something significant. A few responsible adults in the crowd looked uncomfortable and began moving their children away from the scene. William's training kicked in automatically. Any attempt to touch his weapon or his person would require an immediate response. He shifted almost imperceptibly, ready to react if the situation escalated further. His hand remained steady on his rifle, and his breathing stayed controlled, but every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring. The young provocateur seemed to sense that he was walking a fine line. Instead of making physical contact, he began circling William slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You know what I think," he said loudly. "I think these guards are just for show. I bet this guy couldn't handle a real threat if his life depended on it." What the troublemaker didn't know was that William had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. He had faced down enemy combatants in situations far more dangerous than anything this civilian could imagine. But his military decorations were not visible on his ceremonial uniform, and his service record was not something he was permitted to discuss while on duty. From his window above, Prince George watched the scene unfold with growing concern. Even at his young age, he could sense that the situation was becoming uncomfortable for the guard. The prince had been taught about the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity, regardless of their station in life. "Dr. Thornton," he said quietly, "that guard looks like he might need help." His tutor joined him at the window and observed the scene below. Her expression grew serious as she watched the young men continuing their harassment. "Perhaps we should notify security," she suggested. But Prince George was already moving toward the door. "I think I should go down there." "Your Royal Highness, that wouldn't be appropriate. Your personal protection officers would never allow it, and your parents would be very concerned if they knew you were considering intervening in such a situation." The prince paused at the door, his hand on the ornate handle. Something inside him was telling him that this was important, that sometimes doing the right thing meant going against what was expected or safe. He thought about the lessons he had learned about leadership and protecting those who served his family. In the courtyard, the harassment was reaching a crescendo. The leader of the group had pulled out his phone and was now live streaming the encounter, narrating his actions for his online audience. "Watch this, everyone. I'm going to see just how much it takes to make one of these tin soldiers break." He began making exaggerated military gestures in front of William, saluting mockingly and marching in an intentionally clumsy manner. His friends laughed and encouraged him, while the crowd of tourists watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. William remained perfectly still, but inside he was fighting a battle between his training and his natural human instincts. He thought about his grandfather's stories of standing guard during the London Blitz, maintaining his post even as bombs fell around him. He thought about his father's advice on his first day of service: "Remember, son, you're not just protecting buildings or even people. You're protecting an idea, a tradition that connects us to our history and gives meaning to our service." The young provocateur, growing frustrated by William's lack of response, decided to escalate his tactics. He began shouting directly into William's face, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "What's wrong with you? Are you even human? Don't you have any pride? Any self-respect?" These words hit closer to home than the troublemaker could have known. William had struggled with questions about his role and purpose, especially after his military service overseas. He had seen real combat, made life-and-death decisions, and served his country in ways that few people would ever understand. To be reduced to a tourist attraction and mocked by someone who had likely never served anything greater than himself was deeply painful. But, still, he remained motionless. The crowd had grown larger now, with more people stopping to watch the spectacle. Some were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed entertained by the drama. A few tried to intervene verbally, telling the young men to leave the guard alone, but they were largely ignored. Prince George, who had been watching from above, made his decision. Despite Dr. Thornton's protests, he quietly slipped out of the tutoring room and made his way toward the main staircase. His young mind was working quickly, trying to figure out the best way to help without causing more problems. As he descended the grand staircase, he could hear the commotion more clearly. The sound of mocking laughter and cruel taunts made his stomach turn. He had been taught that with privilege came responsibility, and, right now, someone who served his family was being treated badly while he watched from safety. The castle's security protocols were sophisticated, but Prince George knew the building's layout better than most adults. He had spent years exploring every corridor, every shortcut, every hidden passage. Getting to the main entrance without being immediately stopped by his protection officers would require careful timing and a bit of luck. In the courtyard, William was reaching the limits of his endurance. Not physical endurance, he could stand motionless for hours if required, but emotional endurance. The constant stream of insults and mockery was wearing down his professional composure like water eroding stone. The ringleader seemed to sense this and pressed his advantage. "I bet your family is ashamed of you," he sneered. "Standing here like a statue while real people work real jobs. What do you even contribute to society?" These words struck deep because they echoed doubts that William sometimes had himself during quiet moments. Was his service really meaningful? Did it matter that he stood guard, or was he just part of an elaborate piece of theater designed to impress tourists and maintain outdated traditions? But then, he remembered why he had chosen this path. It wasn't about the tourists or the spectacle. It was about being part of something larger than himself, about maintaining a connection to history and tradition that gave structure and meaning to society. His service was a link in a chain that stretched back centuries, connecting him to all the guards who had stood their posts before him. The provocateur, seeing that his verbal attacks weren't getting the desired response, decided to try a different approach. He began making increasingly elaborate gestures and faces, trying to provoke some kind of reaction. His friends joined in, creating a cacophony of noise and movement designed to break William's concentration. Unknown to everyone in the courtyard, Prince George had successfully navigated the castle's corridors and was now approaching the main entrance from inside. His heart was beating fast with nervousness and determination. He had never done anything like this before, but something told him it was the right thing to do. As he reached the final corridor leading to the entrance, he could hear the voices clearly now. The mockery, the laughter, the cruel taunts directed at someone who was serving his family loyally and professionally. The young prince felt a surge of anger on behalf of the guard, followed immediately by a calm determination to act. He paused just inside the entrance, gathering his courage and thinking about what he would say. At 11 years old, he was already being prepared for a life of public service and leadership. Maybe this was his first real test, his first opportunity to stand up for what was right rather than what was safe or expected. Taking a deep breath, Prince George stepped forward into the sunlight of the courtyard, ready to change the course of events in a way that none of the participants could have anticipated. The moment Prince George stepped into the courtyard, everything changed. The bright morning sunlight seemed to catch his young figure perfectly as he emerged from the castle's main entrance, his school clothes neat and his posture straight despite his obvious nervousness. For a split second, the entire scene froze as if someone had pressed pause on a movie. The first person to notice him was an elderly woman from Germany who had been taking photographs of the architecture. She lowered her camera slowly, her mouth falling open as recognition dawned. She had seen enough royal documentaries to know exactly who this young boy was, even without his formal attire. "Mein Gott," she whispered to her husband in German. "Das ist Prince George." Her husband's eyes widened as he followed her gaze. Within moments, a ripple of recognition began spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Tourists began pointing discreetly, their voices dropping to excited whispers. Camera phones were being raised with trembling hands as people tried to capture this unexpected royal appearance. But the group of troublemakers, still focused on their harassment of William, remained oblivious to the new arrival. Their ringleader was in the middle of an particularly crude impersonation of a military salute when Prince George cleared his throat politely but firmly. "Excuse me," the young prince said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite his youth. "I couldn't help but notice what was happening out here." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The young man with the bleached hair spun around, his mocking expression freezing as he found himself face to face with actual royalty. His mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out, like a fish gasping for air. The rest of his group had similar reactions. The one who had nearly touched William's rifle took several quick steps backward, suddenly realizing that their harmless fun had just become infinitely more complicated. Their earlier bravado evaporated like mist in the morning sun. William, still maintaining his position, felt a mixture of relief and concern wash over him. Relief that the harassment had stopped, but concern for the young prince's safety. Royal children weren't supposed to wander into potentially volatile situations without their protection officers present. Prince George stepped forward with a confidence that seemed beyond his years, though if someone looked closely, they might notice the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his nervousness. He had practiced public speaking with his tutors, but this was his first real-world application of those lessons under pressure. "I believe you were speaking to one of our guards," Prince George continued, his tone polite but unmistakably authoritative. "Sergeant Hayes has served our family and our country with distinction for many years. He's a decorated veteran who has risked his life in service to others." The ringleader's face had gone pale beneath his tan. He looked around desperately at his friends, but found no support there. They were all backing away slowly, trying to distance themselves from the situation they now realized had gotten completely out of hand. We were just. I mean. The young man stammered, his earlier eloquence completely deserting him. The crowd of tourists had grown significantly larger now, with people pushing forward to get a better look at the unexpected royal appearance. Many were recording everything on their phones, capturing what they instinctively knew was going to be a viral moment that would be shared around the world within hours. Prince George noticed the crowd but didn't let it distract him from his purpose. "I'm curious," he said, addressing the troublemaker directly. "What exactly were you hoping to accomplish here today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The young man looked around nervously, clearly struggling to come up with an answer that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. "We were just having a bit of fun," he mumbled, his voice barely audible now. "Fun?" Prince George repeated, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Making fun of someone who can't respond while they're doing their job? Someone who has served in combat zones to protect people like you?" The prince's voice remained calm and controlled, but there was an edge to it that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Despite his youth, he was demonstrating a natural authority that came from generations of royal breeding and training. William, still at his post, felt a surge of gratitude toward the young prince. In all his years of service, he had never had anyone stand up for him quite like this. The fact that it was coming from someone so young, someone he was sworn to protect, made it even more meaningful. The troublemaker's friends had now completely abandoned him, melting back into the crowd and pretending they had never been part of the harassment. This left him alone and exposed, facing a member of the royal family while hundreds of people watched and recorded. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said weakly. "It was just a joke." Prince George nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Tell me, what's your name?" The question caught the young man off guard. My name? Why?" "Because," Prince George said calmly, "when someone makes a mistake, taking responsibility for it starts with being willing to identify yourself." "What's your name?" There was a long pause. The young man looked around desperately, but there was no escape from the situation now. The crowd was watching expectantly, phones were recording, and a prince was waiting for an answer. "Tyler," he said finally. "Tyler Morrison." "Well, Tyler Morrison," Prince George continued, "I'd like you to think about something. Sergeant Hayes here stands guard every day, rain or shine, protecting not just my family but the institutions that represent this country. He's been shot at by real enemies in real wars. He's seen things and done things that most of us will never have to experience, all in service to others." Tyler's eyes darted nervously between the prince and the guard, beginning to understand the gravity of what he had been doing. "Now," Prince George continued, "I'm 11 years old, and even I understand that someone who has served others deserves respect, not mockery. What's your excuse?" The question hit like a physical blow. Tyler's face flushed red with embarrassment and shame. Around him, the crowd was murmuring appreciatively at the young prince's words. Several people were nodding in agreement, and he could hear whispered comments of approval. At this moment, Dr. Thornton appeared at the castle entrance, having finally tracked down her royal charge. Her face was a mixture of concern and barely controlled panic as she realized what was happening. Behind her came two royal protection officers, their professional composure intact but their eyes scanning constantly for potential threats. Prince George noticed their arrival but continued speaking. "Tyler, I think you owe Sergeant Hayes an apology." Not because I'm telling you to, but because it's the right thing to do." The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of people held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Tyler stood frozen, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He looked at the guard, then at the prince, then at the crowd of faces all watching him expectantly. William, maintaining his position but listening to every word, felt a complex mix of emotions. He was grateful for Prince George's intervention, but he also felt protective of the young prince and concerned about the potential consequences of this public confrontation. Finally, Tyler stepped forward slightly. His voice was quiet and shaky as he addressed William. I'm sorry, sir. What I did was wrong. I was being stupid and disrespectful, and you didn't deserve that." The words seemed to cost him considerable effort, but they were clearly sincere. The change in his demeanor was complete. The cocky troublemaker had been replaced by a chastened young man who was beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. Prince George nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Tyler. That took courage, and I respect you for it." But the prince wasn't finished. He turned to address the crowd that had gathered, many of whom were still recording the encounter. "I'd like everyone here to understand something important. The people who serve in our military and in roles like Sergeant Hayes's aren't just doing a job. They're maintaining traditions and values that have kept our society stable for centuries." His voice was getting stronger now, as if the act of speaking publicly was giving him confidence. When people mock or disrespect them, they're not just hurting individuals. They're damaging the respect for service and sacrifice that holds our communities together. An older man in the crowd called out, "Well said, Your Royal Highness." This was followed by a spontaneous round of applause that rippled through the gathered tourists. Prince George smiled briefly at the positive response but remained focused on his message. "I know some people question whether monarchy and royal traditions are still relevant in today's world. That's their right in a free society. But the values of service, duty, and respect for others, those are timeless." Tyler, still standing awkwardly in the center of attention, seemed to be processing everything that had happened. The reality of his situation was sinking in. He had been publicly humiliated, but also given an opportunity to learn and grow from his mistake. "Your Royal Highness," he said hesitantly, is there anything I can do to make this right?" Prince George considered the question carefully. "Actually, yes. I think there is something you could do. Sergeant Hayes and all our service members do important work that often goes unrecognized. Maybe you could learn more about what they actually do, instead of making assumptions." Tyler nodded eagerly, grateful for any chance to redeem himself. "I'd like that. I really would." The Royal Protection Officers had now positioned themselves strategically around the scene, and Dr. Thornton was looking increasingly anxious about the length of the prince's public exposure. Prince George seemed to sense this and began moving toward a conclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the crowd, "thank you for witnessing this today. I hope it reminds all of us to treat each other with respect and dignity, especially those who serve others." As he spoke, more security personnel were arriving, including senior members of the royal household staff who looked both impressed and concerned by what they were seeing. The situation was unprecedented. Royal children simply didn't make impromptu public appearances to defend staff members. Tyler approached Prince George one more time. His entire demeanor changed from his earlier behavior. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for teaching me something important today. I won't forget this." Prince George extended his hand for a handshake, which Tyler accepted gratefully. "Everyone makes mistakes, Tyler. What matters is what we do after we realize we've made them." The crowd erupted in applause again, many people visibly moved by the display of maturity and leadership from someone so young. Phones continued recording as the scene played out, capturing what many sensed was a historic moment. William, still maintaining his post but deeply moved by everything that had transpired, felt a renewed sense of pride in his service. The young prince had reminded him, and everyone present, why his role mattered and why the traditions he upheld were worth preserving. As Prince George prepared to return to the castle, escorted by his increasingly relieved tutors and protection officers, he paused for one final moment. The courtyard was still packed with people, all of whom seemed reluctant to leave the scene of such an extraordinary encounter. As Prince George prepared to return to the castle, the atmosphere in the courtyard had completely transformed. What had begun as an ugly scene of harassment had become something extraordinary, a moment of genuine human connection and moral leadership that none of the witnesses would ever forget. But the story was far from over. As news of the incident began to spread, the ripple effects would extend far beyond the castle walls. Dr. Margaret Thornton, still visibly shaken by her young charge's unprecedented public intervention, gently took Prince George's arm as they walked back toward the entrance. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly, "what you did out there was remarkable, but we really must discuss the proper protocols for such situations." Prince George nodded, understanding that his actions, while well-intentioned, had broken numerous rules about royal security and public appearances. "I know, Dr. Thornton. But it felt like the right thing to do. Sometimes rules have to be weighed against doing what's right, don't they?" The question gave his tutor pause. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful, complex reasoning that made teaching the young prince both challenging and rewarding. He was already demonstrating the kind of moral intelligence that would be essential for his future role. Meanwhile, in the crowd, the immediate aftermath of Prince George's intervention was creating its own drama. Tyler Morrison found himself surrounded by tourists who wanted to talk to him about what had just happened. Some were sympathetic, recognizing that he was young and had made a mistake. Others were less forgiving. "That was absolutely disgraceful behavior," said an elderly British woman, her voice sharp with disapproval. "To think that someone your age doesn't understand basic respect for our service members." Tyler hung his head, still processing everything that had occurred. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was completely out of line. I don't know what I was thinking." A middle-aged American tourist, who had been recording the entire encounter, lowered his phone and looked at Tyler thoughtfully. "Son, I'm a veteran myself. Served 2 tours in Iraq. What you did was wrong, but the way you handled yourself after the prince called you out, that showed character. Not everyone can admit when they're wrong." These words seemed to lift Tyler's spirits slightly. He looked up, meeting the veteran's eyes. "Sir, would you mind if I asked you about your service? I think I need to understand better what people like Sergeant Hayes have been through." The veteran smiled, extending his hand. "I'd be happy to talk with you, son. My name's Robert Chen. And I think this could be the start of an important education for you." Back inside the castle, Prince George was facing his own consequences. Word of his impromptu public appearance had reached his parents, Prince William and Catherine, who had just returned from an official engagement. They were waiting in the family's private quarters, their expressions a mixture of concern and pride. "George," Prince William said as his son entered the room, "we need to talk about what just happened out there." The young prince straightened his shoulders, ready to accept whatever punishment might come. "Yes, father. I know I broke protocol." Princess Catherine knelt down to her son's eye level, her expression gentle but serious. "George, what you did was brave and showed real compassion. But you also put yourself and others at risk by acting without your protection officers." "I understand, Mom. But that guard was being treated terribly, and no one else was helping him. I couldn't just watch from the window and do nothing." Prince William exchanged a look with his wife. They both recognized the moral courage their son had displayed, even as they worried about the implications of his actions. "Son," Prince William said carefully, "leadership sometimes means knowing when to act and when to work through proper channels. What you did today showed your heart is in the right place, but we need to talk about better ways to handle similar situations in the future." Outside, the crowd was slowly beginning to disperse, but many people lingered, still buzzing with excitement about what they had witnessed. Social media was already exploding with posts, photos, and videos of the encounter. #Prince George Defends Guard was beginning to trend on Twitter, and news outlets were scrambling to cover the story. Sergeant William Hayes, still at his post, was struggling to maintain his professional composure as tourists continued to approach him with words of support and encouragement. While he couldn't respond directly, the overwhelming positive response from the public was deeply moving. One young girl, about 8 years old, approached with her mother. "Mummy," she said loudly, "is this the guard that the prince helped?" Her mother nodded, smiling at William. "Yes, sweetheart. This is one of the brave guards who protects the royal family." The little girl looked up at William with wide, admiring eyes. "Thank you for being so brave," she said solemnly. "Prince George was right to stick up for you." These simple words from a child hit William harder than all the harassment he had endured earlier. He felt his eyes moisten slightly but maintained his position, touched by the innocent sincerity of the little girl's gratitude. Dr. Thornton, having delivered Prince George to his parents, was now dealing with her own crisis. As the prince's tutor, she was supposed to supervise his activities and ensure his safety. The fact that he had slipped away during her watch to intervene in a public confrontation was a serious breach of her responsibilities. She was called to meet with Sir Edward Mountbatten, the private secretary to the Prince of Wales, who was responsible for coordinating the family's official activities and security arrangements. "Dr. Thornton," Sir Edward said as she entered his office, "I'm sure you understand the gravity of today's situation. Prince George's appearance in the courtyard was completely unscripted and potentially dangerous." "Yes, sir," Dr. Thornton replied. "I take full responsibility for not maintaining proper supervision. However, I must say that what Prince George accomplished out there was quite remarkable for someone his age." Sir Edward nodded grimly. "That may be, but we cannot have royal children making impromptu public appearances, regardless of their noble intentions. The security implications alone are staggering." Meanwhile, back in the courtyard, Tyler Morrison was having a conversation that would change his perspective forever. Robert Chen, the American veteran, had been joined by several other military veterans who happened to be among the tourists that day. "You want to understand what service means?" asked James McPherson, a Scottish veteran of the Falklands War. "Let me tell you what it's really like to put your life on the line for people you've never met." For the next hour, Tyler found himself listening to stories of courage, sacrifice, and dedication that he had never heard before. These men and women had served in conflicts around the world, often in conditions that were unimaginable to civilians. "The thing about standing guard like Sergeant Hayes does," explained Maria Gonzalez, a former Royal Navy officer, "is that it looks easy from the outside. But maintaining that level of discipline and alertness for hours at a time, knowing that you might need to react to a threat at any moment, that takes real training and dedication." Tyler listened intently, beginning to understand the depth of his earlier disrespect. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I thought they were just, I don't know, ceremonial figures." "That's exactly the problem," Robert Chen replied. "People see the fancy uniforms and the tourist attraction aspect, and they forget that these are real soldiers with real training and real responsibilities." As these conversations continued inside the castle, Prince George was receiving what might have been the most important lesson of his young life. His parents had decided that rather than simply punish him for breaking protocol, they would use this as a teaching moment about leadership, responsibility, and the weight of royal privilege. "George," Princess Catherine explained, "when you speak or act in public, your words and actions carry more weight than those of other children your age. People listen to you differently because of who you are." "I know, Mum," Prince George replied. "That's why I thought I should use that to help Sergeant Hayes." Prince William smiled at his son's reasoning. "That shows mature thinking, son. But, with that power comes the responsibility to consider all the consequences of your actions. When you stepped into that courtyard, you weren't just helping a guard, you were speaking for the entire royal family." "Did I say something wrong?" Prince George asked, concern creeping into his voice. "No," his father assured him. "What you said was exactly right. But, in the future, we need to make sure you have the proper support and security when you choose to make such interventions." The discussion was interrupted by a knock on the door. Sir Edward entered with a tablet computer, his expression thoughtful. "Your Royal Highnesses, you might want to see how the public is responding to today's events." He showed them the tablet screen, which displayed a flood of social media posts praising Prince George's actions. News articles were already being published with headlines like "Young Prince shows wisdom beyond his years" and "Royal Child stands up for military service."
The response has been overwhelmingly positive, Sir Edward reported. The public seems genuinely moved by Prince George's defense of Sergeant Hayes. However, we're also getting questions about royal security protocols and how the prince was able to access the courtyard unescorted. Prince William studied the screen thoughtfully. It seems like George's actions have started an important conversation about respect for military service and the role of the royal family in supporting our armed forces. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the morning's events were spreading in unexpected directions. In the nearby town of Windsor, word had spread quickly through the local community about what had happened at the castle. By afternoon, a small but growing group of local veterans had gathered outside the castle gates, not to protest or cause trouble, but to show their support for both Prince George and Sergeant Hayes. Among them was Thomas Hartwell, a 75-year-old veteran of the Korean War who had driven over an hour to be there. What that young prince did today, he told a reporter who had arrived to cover the story, that's the kind of leadership this country needs. Standing up for those who serve, regardless of the personal cost. Back inside the castle, Sergeant Hayes had finally been relieved of his duty and was meeting with his commanding officer, Captain Sarah Mitchell. She had seen the videos of the morning's events and wanted to debrief with him about what had occurred. "How are you feeling about all this, Sergeant?" she asked. William considered the question carefully. "Honestly, ma'am, I'm still processing it. When Prince George stepped out there, I was concerned for his safety. But what he did, it meant more to me than he could possibly know." Captain Mitchell nodded. "The prince showed remarkable courage and maturity. But I'm more interested in how you handled yourself during the harassment. Your composure was exemplary." "Thank you, ma'am. Though I have to admit, there were moments when maintaining that composure was more difficult than usual." "That's understandable," she replied. "What that young man was doing was specifically designed to break down your professional bearing. The fact that you maintained your position and dignity throughout the entire ordeal reflects the highest standards of military discipline." As the day wore on, the story continued to evolve and spread. International news outlets picked up the story, and soon people around the world were watching videos of the young prince defending the royal guard. The hashtag #RespectOurService began trending globally, with veterans and military families sharing their own stories of service and sacrifice. Tyler Morrison, meanwhile, had been transformed by his conversations with the veterans in Windsor. By evening, he had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 12 hours earlier. He approached Robert Chen, who had become an unofficial mentor to him throughout the day. "Mr. Chen," Tyler said, "I've been thinking about everything you and the others have told me today. I want to do something meaningful to make up for what I did this morning." "What did you have in mind?" Robert asked. "I want to volunteer with veteran organizations. I want to learn more about military service and find ways to support people like Sergeant Hayes. And I want to share what I've learned with my friends, so maybe they won't make the same mistakes I did." Robert smiled, clapping Tyler on the shoulder. "Son, that's exactly the kind of response I was hoping to hear. There are plenty of organizations that would welcome your help and enthusiasm." As the sun began to set over Windsor Castle, the events of the day had created connections and conversations that would continue long after the tourists had gone home and the guards had changed shifts. Prince George's spontaneous act of moral courage had not only defended one guard's dignity but had sparked a broader dialogue about respect, service, and the responsibilities that come with leadership at any age. 3 months had passed since that transformative morning in Windsor Castle's courtyard, and the ripple effects of Prince George's intervention continued to spread in ways that no one could have anticipated. What had started as a simple act of defending a guard had grown into something much larger and more meaningful. Sergeant William Hayes stood once again at his post outside the castle, but the atmosphere around him had changed dramatically. Tourists still gathered to take photos and observe the changing of the guard, but there was a new sense of respect and understanding in their behavior. Gone were the attempts to provoke reactions or treat the guards as mere tourist attractions. The change wasn't just at Windsor Castle. Reports from Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, and other royal sites indicated that the public's attitude toward the guards had shifted significantly. The viral videos of Prince George's defense had educated millions of people about the real role and
background of these service members. William reflected on how much his own life had changed since that day. He had received hundreds of letters from veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens expressing their support and gratitude for his service. Many shared their own stories of military service or thanked him for maintaining traditions that connected them to their history and values. One letter that particularly moved him came from a young boy in Australia whose father was deployed overseas with the military. The boy wrote, "Dear Sergeant Hayes, I saw the video of Prince George standing up for you, and it made me proud of my dad who is a soldier too. Thank you for showing that serving others is important and honorable." These personal connections had given William a renewed sense of purpose in his role. He was no longer just standing guard, he was representing the dignity of service itself. Inside the castle, Prince George was finishing another tutoring session with Dr. Thornton, but their relationship had evolved considerably since that eventful day. The prince had not been punished for his breach of protocol, but instead had been given additional responsibilities and training to help him understand how to channel his instincts for leadership in more structured ways. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Thornton said as they reviewed the morning's lessons on constitutional history, "you have a visitor this afternoon who I think you'll find quite interesting." Prince George looked up from his notes with curiosity. "Who is it?" "Tyler Morrison," she replied with a smile. "The young man from the courtyard. He's requested a meeting to update you on some projects he's been working on." The prince's face lit up with interest. He had often wondered what had become of Tyler after their confrontation. "That's wonderful. I'd very much like to see him." When Tyler arrived at the castle an hour later, the transformation in him was remarkable. Gone was the cocky troublemaker who had harassed Sergeant Hayes. In his place was a confident but respectful young man who carried himself with new purpose and maturity. "Your Royal Highness," Tyler said as he was escorted into the castle's formal reception room, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I wanted to share with you what's happened since our meeting in the courtyard." Prince George gestured for Tyler to sit down, his curiosity evident. "Please, tell me everything." Tyler took a deep breath and began his story. "After that day, I spent weeks talking with veterans and learning about military service. Mr. Chen, the American veteran who spoke with me, introduced me to local veteran organizations. I started volunteering at a center that helps former service members transition back to civilian life." The prince listened intently as Tyler described his volunteer work. "What kind of things do you do there?" "Lots of different things," Tyler replied enthusiastically. "I help with computer training for older veterans, I assist with job placement programs, and I've started a social media campaign to share positive stories about military service. We call it Honor Their Service, and it's reached over 500,000 people so far." Prince George was impressed by the scope of Tyler's transformation. "That sounds like incredible work. But what made you want to get so involved?" Tyler paused, choosing his words carefully. "Honestly, Your Royal Highness, it was what you said to me that day. You asked what my excuse was for not understanding that people who serve others deserve respect. I realized I didn't have a good excuse, and that meant I needed to educate myself and try to make a positive difference." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince William, who had heard about Tyler's visit and wanted to meet the young man whose encounter with his son had made such an impact. "Mr. Morrison," Prince William said as he entered the room, "I've heard remarkable things about the work you've been doing since you met George." Tyler stood and bowed respectfully. "Your Royal Highness, it's an honor to meet you. Your son changed my life that day, and I wanted to make sure I used that change for good." Prince William smiled, clearly impressed by Tyler's sincerity and the mature way he carried himself. "George, why don't you show Mr. Morrison the memorial garden? I think he'd appreciate seeing the tributes to our service members." As the two young people walked through the castle's memorial garden, Tyler shared more details about his volunteer work. "One of the most important things I learned," he said, "is that many veterans struggle with feeling appreciated or understood when they return to civilian life. The work we're doing tries to bridge that gap." Prince George nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. I think that's part of what was happening with Sergeant Hayes that day. Those men were treating him like he wasn't a real person with real experiences. they paused at a memorial dedicated to military personnel who had served the royal family over the centuries. Tyler read the inscriptions carefully, his expression becoming more solemn. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, "I want to apologize again for what I did that day. Looking at this memorial, understanding the history and sacrifice it represents, I realize how deeply disrespectful my behavior was." Prince George turned to face Tyler directly. "Tyler, you've already apologized, and, more importantly, you've taken action to make things right. That's what real character looks like." Back in the courtyard where it had all begun, a small ceremony was taking place. Robert Chen, the American veteran who had mentored Tyler, was visiting England with a group of international veterans for a commemoration event. They had specifically requested to meet Sergeant Hayes and thank him for his service. Captain Sarah Mitchell introduced the visiting veterans to William, who was honored to meet service members from different countries and different eras. "Sergeant Hayes," she said, "these gentlemen wanted to meet you after hearing about the events of 3 months ago." Robert Chen stepped forward, extending his hand to William. "Sergeant, it's an honor to meet you. Your professionalism during the difficult situation was an inspiration to military personnel around the world." William shook hands with each veteran, moved by their gesture of solidarity and support. "Thank you all for your service," he replied. "It means more than you know to have your respect and understanding." An elderly British veteran named Alfred Pemberton, who had served in World War II, spoke up. "Son, I've been standing guard in one form or another for over 60 years, and I can tell you that what you did that day, maintaining your dignity and position despite severe provocation, that's the mark of a true professional soldier." These words carried special weight coming from someone with such extensive experience. William felt a deep sense of validation for his choice to pursue this career path and his commitment to upholding military traditions. Inside the castle, Prince George and Tyler were being joined by Dr. Thornton for what had become an impromptu educational session about the role of military service in democratic societies. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Thornton said, "I'm curious about how your perspective on authority and service has changed since you began your volunteer work." Tyler considered the question carefully. "I used to think that questioning authority meant being disrespectful or confrontational. But I've learned that true respect means understanding why institutions and traditions exist, and then working to improve them rather than just tearing them down." Prince George was fascinated by this insight. "That's exactly what my parents have been teaching me about being royal. It's not enough to just inherit a position, you have to understand why it matters and how to use it responsibly." "Exactly," Tyler agreed. "I think that's why what you did that day was so powerful. You used your position to defend someone who couldn't defend himself, and you did it in a way that educated everyone watching." Dr. Thornton smiled, pleased with the depth of understanding both young men were demonstrating. "This is precisely the kind of thoughtful leadership that both of you will need as you move forward in your respective roles." As their conversation continued, news was breaking that would add another layer to the ongoing story. The BBC had just announced that they were producing a documentary about the incident in the courtyard and its aftermath, focusing on how a single moment of moral courage had sparked broader conversations about service, respect, and leadership. The documentary would feature interviews with Prince George, with appropriate royal protocols, Tyler Morrison, Sergeant Hayes, and various experts on military service and youth leadership. It was scheduled to air on Remembrance Day, making it part of the nation's annual tribute to military service members. When Prince George learned about the documentary, he was both excited and nervous about the attention it would bring. "Dr. Thornton," he asked, "do you think it's appropriate for me to participate? I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to get credit for something that was just the right thing to do." His tutor considered the question thoughtfully. "Your Royal Highness, I think your participation could be very valuable if it helps people understand the importance of standing up for others and treating service members with respect. The key is to focus on the message rather than on yourself." Tyler, who had also been invited to participate in the documentary, was initially hesitant as well. "I'm worried people will think I'm just trying to get attention or make myself look good," he confided to Prince George. "But, Tyler," the prince replied, "your story shows that people can change and grow. That might inspire others who have made similar mistakes to try to make things right." Meanwhile, Sergeant Hayes was dealing with his own complex feelings about the renewed attention. While he was grateful for the increased respect he and his fellow guards were receiving, he was concerned about becoming too much of a public figure.
Captain Mitchell addressed his concerns during a meeting.
"Sergeant, I understand your discomfort with the attention, but you've become a symbol of military professionalism and dedication. Your participation in this documentary could help the public better understand what military service really means." "Ma'am," William replied, "if it helps people appreciate the sacrifices that service members make, then I'm honored to participate. But I want to make sure the focus stays on the broader issues, not on me personally." As the documentary preparation began, it became clear that the story had resonated far beyond what anyone had initially expected. The production team received thousands of messages from veterans, military families, and young people who had been inspired by the events at Windsor Castle. One particularly moving message came from a group of American high school students who had started their own program to support local veterans after seeing the viral video of Prince George's intervention. Their letter read, "Prince George showed us that young people can make a real difference when we stand up for what's right. We started visiting veterans in our community, and it's changed all of our lives." Similar initiatives were reported from countries around the world. In Canada, a group of teenagers organized a fundraising campaign for veteran mental health services. In Australia, young people started a social media campaign sharing stories of military sacrifice. In Germany, students began visiting elderly veterans to record their memories for historical preservation. Tyler Morrison had become something of an unofficial coordinator for these youth-led initiatives. "Your Royal Highness," he told Prince George during one of their regular meetings, "I never imagined that one moment of stupidity on my part could lead to so much positive action around the world." Prince George smiled at Tyler's characterization of events. "I don't think it was your stupidity that led to this, Tyler. I think it was your willingness to admit you were wrong and, then, work to make things better. That's what inspired people." As Remembrance Day approached and the documentary neared completion, all the participants reflected on how much had changed since that morning in the castle courtyard. What had started as an ugly incident of harassment had become a catalyst for broader conversations about respect, service, and the responsibility that comes with leadership at any age. Sergeant William Hayes, standing once again at his post on the morning before Remembrance Day, watched as a group of young people approached. But, instead of the mockery and provocation he might have expected months earlier, they approached respectfully and quietly laid a small wreath at the base of the castle wall. One of them, a young woman about Tyler's age, looked up at him and mouthed the words, "Thank you for your service." Then, they moved on quietly, leaving William deeply moved by their gesture of respect and appreciation. Inside the castle, Prince George was putting the finishing touches on a speech he would deliver at the documentary premiere. The speech would emphasize the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, especially those who dedicate their lives to serving others. As he worked on his remarks, the young prince reflected on how much he had learned from that spontaneous decision to step into the courtyard 3 months earlier. It had taught him about the weight of his position, the power of moral courage, and the ripple effects that can result from a single moment of doing what's right. The story that had begun with harassment and provocation had become a tale of transformation, education, and hope, proving that even in moments of conflict and disrespect, there are always opportunities for growth, learning, and positive change.